6:40 a.m. Taiwo Hassan opened his eyes, but for the first few seconds, the 66-year-old actor did not move. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor as if his body needed time to negotiate with the morning. There was no ambulance outside, no emergency room, and no confirmed report that he was battling terminal cancer or facing an immediately life-threatening diagnosis. Yet something about that quiet morning felt different. His feet touched the floor slowly. One hand pressed against the mattress while the other rested on the edge of the bed. He waited. Then he tried to stand. Across the room, Ajoke Taiwo watched without saying anything. She had seen her husband face exhausting schedules, long filming days, constant travel, and the pressure that comes with spending decades in front of cameras. But this was an opponent no actor could simply walk away from when the director shouted, "Cut!" It was age itself. The small changes were becoming harder to ignore, movements that appeared more deliberate, pauses that seemed longer, and moments when the man who had spent years moving from one commitment to another appeared to listen carefully to what his own body was telling him. For Ajoke, that realization could carry a pain difficult to describe. The person beside her was still the same husband she had known, yet time was quietly changing the rhythm of their ordinary life. And perhaps that was what made the scene so unsettling. There was no dramatic announcement, only silence. What happens when a man accustomed to pushing through fatigue suddenly realizes that determination cannot always command the body? According to publicly discussed accounts of his long career, Taiwo Hassan has spent decades working in an industry where demanding schedules can become part of everyday life. But at 66, the question was no longer simply how much work he could accept. It was how carefully he needed to protect the strength he still had. Ajoke remained only a few steps away, watching him finally rise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with ordinary morning light, and Taiwo slowly walked toward the doorway. Behind him, the edge of the bed remained slightly pressed down where he had been sitting, while Ajoke continued staring at the empty space he had just left. There was a time when Taiwo Hassan seemed capable of moving faster than the schedule itself. Years earlier, a working day could begin before the streets were fully awake and continue until the lights on set had already been burning for hours. He could walk quickly toward the cameras, exchange a few words with the crew, study what needed to be done, and prepare for another scene while the previous one still seemed fresh in everyone's mind. To audiences watching from home, that was the Taiwo they remembered, energetic, commanding, and seemingly untouched by exhaustion. But cameras capture performances, not everything that happens between them. Behind the scenes were long hours, repeated movements, waiting, traveling, and the constant demand to be ready when someone called his name. Back then, his body could often follow whatever his calendar demanded. Years passed almost invisibly. One production became another, one journey followed the next, and the man walking onto a set rarely had a reason to wonder whether his strength would always remain the same. Then came 66. Not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a quiet boundary between the man he remembered being and the man standing in the present. Age does not affect everyone in exactly the same way, and ordinary changes associated with getting older should never be mistaken for evidence of a specific illness. Yet for many people, aging can mean learning to respect limits that once seemed distant. Imagine the contrast. The younger Taiwo moving rapidly toward the next scene, while the older Taiwo notices a chair and chooses to sit for another minute. A glass of water remains within reach. The pause between two commitments becomes slightly longer. None of these moments needs to be dramatic to carry emotional weight. Sometimes the most unsettling changes are the smallest ones. Ajoke could remember the man who seemed always ready for the next destination, and now she could see why protecting his energy mattered more than proving he could still maintain yesterday's pace. There was no betrayal by another person here. If anything felt like betrayal, it was time itself, the silent force that allows someone to build decades of memories while gradually taking away the effortless strength of youth. And somewhere between one task and the next, Taiwo sat quietly for a moment, his hand beside the untouched glass of water, while the empty chair opposite him seemed to hold the shadow of the younger man who once never needed to stop. For Ajoke Taiwo, the passage of time could never be measured only by birthdays or numbers on a calendar. It could be seen in smaller things, in moments so ordinary that the outside world would probably never notice them. To the public, Taiwo Hassan remained the familiar face they had watched for years, a performer whose presence carried memories of countless roles and long days before the camera. But home was different. There were no carefully positioned lights there, no director deciding when a scene should begin or end. Imagine an evening when dinner had already been placed on the table. The food slowly lost its warmth while a conversation continued between two people who had shared years of life together. Then a phone lit up nearby with another reminder, another commitment, another piece of a schedule that once might have seemed completely routine. Ajoke looked toward the phone, then toward her husband, and finally toward the clock. She did not need to say anything. The silence itself carried the question. How long can someone continue living according to the rhythm of a younger version of himself? This was not evidence of a specific medical condition, nor proof of any dramatic health crisis. It was something more universal, and in its own way, more painful. The realization that age gradually changes what a person can ask of himself. Perhaps that is one of the hardest things for a longtime partner to witness. The public remembers performances, photographs, and appearances. A wife notices the spaces between them. She notices when there is less urgency to leave the chair, when rest becomes something worth protecting, or when tomorrow's schedule suddenly deserves a second look. None of those details alone means anything frightening. Together, however, they can remind a family that time has been moving even when nobody was paying attention. Ajoke had known Taiwo through years in which work, family, and responsibility competed for the same 24 hours. Now, at 66, the image of endless energy belonged increasingly to memory. There was no need for tears to make that realization painful. Sometimes love becomes most visible through watching, through noticing what another person might never explain aloud. The phone screen eventually went dark. The clock continued moving. On the table, the meal had grown cold, and Ajoke remained seated across from the man whose familiar face still carried traces of every younger version of himself she had known. The studio lights came on one by one, and suddenly everything looked familiar again. Cameras were being positioned, cables stretched across the floor, crew members moved quickly between equipment, and somewhere beyond the bright set, Taiwo Hassan waited for his turn. For decades, this environment had represented movement, work, purpose, the place where exhaustion could be forgotten the moment the camera started rolling. But at 66, the same surroundings could carry a different question. How long should a man continue demanding yesterday's strength from today's body? Taiwo sat behind the set while preparations continued around him. The chair beneath him was ordinary, perhaps almost invisible to everyone else, yet within this story it had become something more. Years earlier, a chair might have been somewhere to sit for 2 minutes before standing again and rushing toward another scene. Now it represented permission to slow down, and perhaps that was precisely what made it difficult to accept. The real battle had no gunfire, no enemy standing across the room, and no dramatic announcement. It existed inside a man caught between two instincts: continue at the rhythm that had defined much of his life, or begin respecting the limits that naturally become more important with age. What frightens a longtime performer more, the possibility of becoming tired, or the thought that one day the place where he has always stood may continue without him? That is where the sense of loss becomes deeper. It is not about losing life or family. It is about confronting the possibility of losing part of an identity built through decades of work. For an artist, the camera can become more than equipment. The set can become more than a workplace. They become witnesses to years of ambition, sacrifice, and belonging. Around Taiwo, younger footsteps crossed the studio floor. Someone adjusted a light. Another person checked the camera. Everything continued moving with the same urgency it always had, while he remained seated for another moment. Perhaps growing older sometimes means discovering that the world does not automatically slow down when you do. The lights grew brighter. His turn was approaching. Taiwo placed his hands on the arms of the chair and leaned slightly forward, preparing to rise. For a second, the empty space in front of him seemed enormous. Then someone beyond the lights called for the next scene, and the chair remained behind him, waiting in the shadows. At 66, victory does not necessarily look the way it once did. For Taiwo Hassan, there were years when success could be measured by movement. Another role completed, another production finished, another audience recognizing the face that had become familiar across generations. In youth, there is often an assumption that tomorrow will arrive with roughly the same strength as today. The body recovers, the schedule continues, and another opportunity waits somewhere ahead. An actor walks onto a set thinking about the scene, not about how much energy it will require simply to reach the end of the day. But decades have a price. Every early morning, every long journey, every hour beneath studio lights becomes part of a life that cannot be replayed. Taiwo's long career represents years that gave him recognition and memories, but those same years also carried him inevitably toward an age when success could begin to mean something quieter. There is no need to turn aging into tragedy to understand its emotional weight. At 66, victory might simply be opening your eyes in the morning and feeling ready to begin. It might be completing the work you promised to do without forcing yourself beyond reasonable limits. It might be walking back through your own front door at the end of the day and finding a joke there. The applause eventually disappears. Studio lights are switched off. Costumes are removed, cameras are packed away, and the public moves on to another story. What remains is the person who has to carry his own body home. Perhaps this is where the definition of strength changes. When Taiwo was younger, strength may have meant continuing despite exhaustion. Now, strength can also mean knowing when to stop, when to sit down, when to drink the glass of water beside him, and when to leave something unfinished until tomorrow. For someone whose identity has been tied to work for so long, accepting that change may be harder than any performance. Yet there is another kind of achievement hidden inside it, learning that slowing down does not erase everything that came before. Evening arrives. Taiwo returns home. A chair waits beside the table, and somewhere nearby, a joke is going about the ordinary routines of their shared life. There is no audience here, no applause, and no camera recording the moment. Taiwo sits down. For several seconds, nothing happens. And perhaps, after decades of always needing to do something, being able to simply sit beside the person who has traveled through those years with him has become a victory of its own. For a joke, the hardest part may not have been anything that happened on a film set. It was time itself, the one thing she could neither negotiate with nor ask to slow down. When two people spend many years beside each other, love gradually becomes woven into routines so small that they almost disappear from notice. A particular place at the dining table, the sound of familiar footsteps approaching a room, a chair that somehow belongs to one person even though nobody ever officially decided it, the approximate hour when the front door usually opens after another working day. These details can seem meaningless until the possibility of change enters the mind. Taiwo Hassan was 66 now, and while aging should never automatically be treated as illness or tragedy, it carries one undeniable truth. Time continues moving regardless of how deeply two people wish to preserve what they have. A joke could look across the room and see the same man whose presence had become part of the architecture of everyday life. Yet perhaps she looked a little longer than before, not because there had been some confirmed medical emergency, but because growing older makes certain questions increasingly difficult to ignore. If Taiwo had to learn that his body could no longer be expected to obey every demanding schedule without limits, a joke faced a different struggle. She could encourage him to rest. She could make sure there was water nearby. She could notice when another commitment seemed unnecessary. She could sit beside him when the day became quiet. But she could not stop another birthday from arriving. She could not return his body to the effortless energy of decades earlier. That is the helplessness hidden inside long companionship. Love can protect many things, but it cannot negotiate with time. Evening settled around the house. Perhaps a phone vibrated somewhere with another work notification, but for once it seemed distant. Taiwo remained in his familiar chair. A joke sat nearby, her attention resting on him for several seconds longer than usual. There were no dramatic words between them, no tears needed to explain the moment. Outside, life continued normally. Inside, the clock moved forward with tiny mechanical clicks. A joke eventually looked away, but the chair remained within the corner of her vision. The same chair that had always seemed completely ordinary, suddenly carrying the uncomfortable reminder that even the most familiar things in a home are precious, precisely because nobody can promise they will remain unchanged forever. The lights came on again. For anyone walking into the studio, almost nothing seemed to have changed. Cameras stood in their familiar positions. Cables crossed the floor. Crew members moved quickly from one corner to another, checking equipment, adjusting lights, and preparing for the next scene. Voices overlapped in the background. Someone called a name. Someone else counted down the minutes. It was the same world Taiwo Hassan had entered countless times before. And yet, standing just beyond the brightest lights, Taiwo was no longer the same man who had first walked into that world decades earlier. For a moment, imagine the two versions of him occupying the same space. The younger Taiwo moves toward the camera without hesitation, his steps quick, his attention already fixed on the work ahead. He does not study the distance between himself and the set. He simply crosses it. Then the image changes. Taiwo at 66 stands in almost the same place. The cameras are still waiting, the lights are still burning. But before moving forward, he pauses for several seconds. Nothing dramatic happens. That is precisely why the moment carries so much weight. The battle with age does not come with a final scene in which someone raises a hand and declares victory. It begins again every morning. There can be days when energy comes easily and the familiar rhythm returns. There can also be days when the body asks for patience, when another pause matters more than another display of endurance. Neither experience should be mistaken for evidence of a specific illness. They are reminders that human strength changes with time. And perhaps the most painful part is not simply growing older. It is remembering exactly how powerful you once felt. The mind can still carry the younger man effortlessly, the man who could move from one responsibility to another without wondering whether he needed to slow down. Memory does not age at the same speed as the body. Somewhere inside Taiwo, that younger performer still walks quickly toward the camera. But outside, the 66-year-old man has learned that continuing does not always mean moving at the same speed. A crew member passed behind him. The set was ready. Taiwo took another step, then another. Behind him stood the chair that had followed this story from one quiet moment to the next. Ahead of him, the studio lights grew brighter. For several seconds, his shadow stretched across the floor, and strangely, beneath those lights, it seemed to belong both to the man standing there now and to the younger actor who had walked the same path so many years before. 9:17 p.m. The day had finally become quiet. No studio lights remained around Taiwo Hassan now, no cameras were waiting for him, and no one was counting the seconds before another scene began. He sat in the familiar chair at home while the room rested beneath a soft evening light. His phone lay on the table beside him. For a moment, the screen illuminated the edge of his hand, then slowly went dark. Somewhere nearby, a joke was still awake. Neither of them spoke about tomorrow. There was no reason to. After a lifetime built around schedules, perhaps silence had become one of the few things that did not demand anything from him. On the table was an old photograph. Taiwo picked it up and looked at the younger man captured inside it. The face was unmistakably his, yet time had placed an enormous distance between that image and the person holding it. Fewer lines marked the younger face. the posture seemed lighter. Ahead of that man appeared to be an almost endless collection of years. Roles not yet performed, journeys not yet taken, mornings not yet lived. He could not have known how quickly those years would eventually become memories. Now, at 66, Taiwo looked at that photograph from the opposite side of time. Perhaps that is one of aging's strangest experiences. The person you once were never completely disappears. He remains inside photographs, recordings, and memories, permanently young, while the person looking back continues changing. A joke was only a short distance away. The ordinary familiarity of her presence made the room feel complete. Outside the window, traffic continued passing through the night. Headlights briefly crossed the walls and disappeared. Somewhere, another car sounded its horn. Life outside continued moving without noticing the quiet scene inside. Taiwo lowered the photograph and placed it carefully back on the table. Across from him stood another chair, empty and perfectly still. He remained seated for several more seconds, looking somewhere beyond the photograph. Then he placed both hands on his knees. Slowly, without urgency, he pushed himself upright. One step carried him away from the chair. Then another took him toward the darker part of the room. An imaginary camera could have followed him, but it did not. It remained exactly where it was. Taiwo disappeared beyond the frame. The old photograph stayed on the table. The chair he had occupied was now empty. Outside, the traffic continued, and inside the room, one final light was still burning.